Hey guys, so good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm not sure what time you're watching this, but this is lesson 7, and we're going to cover some graphing vocabulary, and we're going to look at the 7 important parts that every graph needs to have. Okay, so we're going to start with our first word here, and the word is scale. Okay, so a scale is the set of numbers that are along the y-axis that are used to show the data on the graph. The scale always starts with the 0 except on a line plot. So yesterday's lesson, we looked at the different kinds of graphs. So we have our bar graphs, our line graphs, we have circle graphs, we have line plots, and then we have pictographs. So pretty much all of those graphs use a y-axis except for the line plot. So that's the only one that doesn't start at 0. And I'll talk a little bit about that later. But when we think about a scale, it's that vertical axis right here going up and down, and it always starts at 0, and then it can go up through whatever it needs to go to, 100, 1,000, 2,000, whatever it is that how high you need it to go for the amount of data that you have. So here I have 2 examples. Our first example right here goes from 0 to 100. So everything that we would have in our data table would have to have amounts that are somewhere between 0 and 100 to use this scale. And our second example goes from 0 to 50. So the same thing, all of our data would have to fall between 0 and 50 to be able to use that scale. Okay, our second new piece of vocabulary is the word interval. And interval is the distance between numbers on a scale, and this is what we count by on the scale. So I'm using the same scales that I had on the last slide, and looking at this, now we need to figure out what are we counting by, or what are the numbers moving up in increasing by. So when I look at this first one, it's going from 0 to 20, 20 to 40, 40 to 60. So that is counting by or having an interval of 20. So I'm counting by 20s each time. This second one, I'm going from 0 to 10, 10 to 20. So when I look at that, I think, what am I counting by when I go 0 to 10, 10 to 20? Well, I'm counting by 10, so this has an interval or a count by 10. So I'm increasing by 10 through each one. This one down here at the bottom is from yesterday's line plot example. I think it was the height of the second graders was the example I used for line plots. This is the only scale that doesn't start with 0, okay? Because line plots are just the middle section of information or data. So this one starts at 40 and goes the whole way to 49. And so when I look at this, it goes from 40 to 41 to 42 to 43. So we're counting by, or we have an interval of 1 for that one. So each time it's increasing by 1. So if this kept going, the next one would be 50 and then 51, and it would keep going that way. Okay, so we have a third one. This one is very, very new. It's brand new for you guys. You've probably never heard it before. And it's something that sometimes happens in a graph. Okay, so this is called a break, and it's a symbol that's used on a graph to show that there's no data between 0 and the first number in the scale. So when I look at this scale that's over here, this is the one from yesterday that I used with line graphs, I believe, and it was the XYZ Toy Company, and this was the scale that was there. So when we look at this, between 0 and 60, there's this little zigzag kind of lightning bolt or sideways M looking thing. That's our symbol that means a break. So what that means is when XYZ was keeping track of the sales in their millions of dollars, they didn't have any numbers each year that they were keeping track of their scales that were between 0 and 60 million. So instead of putting 20 and 40 in there and having wasted space, they just broke that scale right there and just said, hey, that's unimportant information, so we're going to make it disappear. And the symbol just says, hey, that chunk has been taken out, okay? We can't just skip from 0 to 60 and then go 60 to 80 because that would be an interval of 60 and then 20. Our interval always has to be consistent. So if it's not going to be consistent, we can do a break. Now, the important part of about a break is you can only do it between 0 and your smallest piece of data. You can't put a break like up here in the middle and say, oh, there's nothing between 120 and 160, so I'm going to put a break there. It always has to be between 0 and your lowest data number. Okay, so that's what our break is, and it's just a symbol that we use if we need it. We don't have to have it in every scale. Okay, so here's a couple examples. The question is, what is the interval? So we're gonna look at this, and I'm gonna tell you to pause and think about it, and then come back to me when you have an answer. Okay, so the first example here goes from 0 to 1, then 2, 3, 4, and 5. So figure out what the interval is. I'm going to ask you to hit pause when you're ready to hear the answer come back. Okay, so I'm hoping that you came up with the answer that the interval, or what we're counting by for this one, is 1. Okay, go ahead and hit pause and think about the next one. Okay, our interval for the next one, 0 to 2, 2 to 4, is jumping by 2. Okay, figure out the next one. Okay, so for this third one, we're jumping from 0 to 5, 5 to 10, which is counting by 5s. Okay, and then we have our fourth one, 0 to 10, 10 to 20. Go ahead and hit pause when you're ready, come back. Okay, our interval for that one is counting by tens, and it would just keep going. So if I continued with the first one, the next number would be 6. And on the second one, the next one would be 12. This one would be 30. Counting by tens, this one would be 60. Oh, let's look at this fifth one. Oh, look at this symbol down here. That means there's a break, which means there is no data that needs to be recorded between 0 and 80. So we're not going to look at, hey, that's part of my interval. I'm going to start at 80 and then go to 82 and 84. So that's where I'm going to figure out my interval. So what's the interval between 80 and 82 and 82 and 84? Go ahead and come up with your answer. Okay, the interval for that one, I hope you're sitting there thinking in your head, oh, Mrs. Lehman, we're counting by 2s, because that would be the correct answer. Okay, so we're going to look at two different types of scales here. So I have two bar graphs below that show the same data for household light bulbs, but they're using different scales. So when we look at example 1, we have a scale that's going from 0 to 9,000, and the interval for that one is going from 0 to 1,000, 1,000 to 2,000. So it's jumping 1,000 numbers each time. Okay, so looking at that graph, here's where all of our data is plotted on this graph that goes from 0 to 9,000 with an interval of 1,000. Now let's jump over and look at example 2. Okay, so in example 2, we have a scale that goes from 0 to 1,800. Ooh, that's a lot smaller compared to going to 9,000. And when we look at our interval here on this second one, it's jumping from 0 to 200, 200 to 400. So our interval is 200. And then look at how the information is plotted on that graph compared to example 1. Okay, so just kind of analyze both of those graphs. And then here's my question. Okay, and I'm going to ask you to think about it, and then I'm going to give you the correct answer. So it says, which graph has a scale that makes it easier to give a closer estimate of each bulb's brightness? So these bulbs are being measured in lumens. Okay, I don't know a lot about light bulbs, but I know it has something to do with watts and lumens. Okay, so so when I look at example 1 compared to example 2, which graph has the better scale that makes it easier for me to figure out how many lumens the different types of light bulbs have? So I'm going to let you think about it. Okay, so I hope that you're sitting there thinking in your head, Mrs. Lehman, is example 2. Okay, if you weren't thinking example 2, I'm going to tell you why you should have been thinking example 2. Okay, so when we look at example 1, the reason that it's not the best choice is because in example 1, because our scale goes the whole way from 0 to 9,000, look at all of this wasted space. And when we talked about graphing yesterday, I said the point was that graphs were supposed to create a pretty little picture where the information pops. That information is not popping, because if I look here at this 25 watt bulb, it's somewhere between 0 and 1,000. It looks like it could be like 200, 300. I'm not sure. It's really hard to figure out because that's such a big jump between 0 and 1,000 to kind of guess where that's actually at. But if I look over here at example 2, we don't have any wasted space. And when I look at this, because the interval is only 200, I can see that this 25-watt bulb is slightly above 200. It's definitely not up at 300, but it's somewhere between 200 and 300. I might say 230, 240, but I can make a better estimate, which is what was being asked. Which one gives you a better chance of finding the closer estimate? So because of all the wasted space in example 1, that's why it's a bad example. But in example 2, picked a great scale. It only had to go up to 1800 because that's really close to where the highest data was, and it had a great interval of 200 apiece for you to come up with a good estimate. Okay, so I want to show you guys one more thing before we end for today. We're going to get into looking at making some graphs. So in order to do that, I want to talk about the 7 important parts that every graph should have. Now, there's 6 parts that every graph should have, and then there's 1 part that some should have. So I'm going to start here on the left, and I'm going to show you the parts of the graph, and then I'm going to go over to the right, the example, and say, oh, let's look, here's where it's at. Okay, so in graphing, the very first important part that every graph needs to have is some type of title. Okay, so when we look over at our example, here in our example graph, our title is XYZ Toy Company. Where did I get that information? From the data table. In your data table, your title should more than likely be there as the heading for the entire table. Okay, so the second and third important thing that all graphs need to have is on your x-axis, you're going to have category labels. So your category labels depend on what was being analyzed. So let's say students' favorite fruits. So your category labels would be like apples, pears, peaches, pineapple, and then your label for x-axis would be the word fruit. So you would have all your little category labels, and then underneath that you would have the word fruit because what was being analyzed were the different fruits. Okay. You also might have years here, so it might be like 1995, 1996, 1997, and then your label for that entire axis would be years. When we go over here and look at the XYZ Toy Company, that's exactly what I was just talking about. So this one's, the category labels are years, and then the whole x-axis label tells me what those things are, which were years. Okay, so that's 2 and 3. The fourth very important thing that a graph needs to have is a scale with an appropriate interval. So it has to start at 0, and then it has to come up from 0 to whatever, and you need to pick a consistent interval. This one goes by ones. Okay, now when you're making your decision about your scale, you need to decide if a break is needed. If you don't need one, don't put it. But if there's a big jump between 0 and your smallest piece of data, put a break. So number 5 is the thing that might be in a graph, but it also might not. When we look over here at our XYZ Toy Company, they go from 0 to 160, and they do use a break in between 0 and $60 million. The next thing you need, because you have numbers going on your y-axis, you need a label for what do those numbers stand for. So if I'm going from 0 to 6, 6 what or 3 what whenever I'm plotting that. So when I go over here and I look at my example, all those numbers stand for sales in millions of dollars. Okay. And then the last super duper important thing that you need in a graph is properly placed data. So if you're creating a line graph, you need to have points. If you're creating a bar graph, you need to have bars, and they need to be put up to the right amount. I'll talk more about all of that tomorrow. But looking over here at the XYZ Toy Company, properly placed data. So because it's a line graph, they're plotting points. So they just have to go 1992, 120. So 1992, 120, and place their dot right there and continue doing that until they have all their dots created. And because it's a line graph, then all those dots need connected from beginning to end, and that's properly placed data. Okay, guys, so tomorrow I'm going to do a lesson on how do you exactly make a line graph and a bar graph from scratch. Okay, and so check out tomorrow's video and have a great day.